So hello everybody and welcome to episode 2 of the World Rescue Organisation Trauma mini-series. Once again, myself, Ian Marriott, the WRO Head Assessor, and Cameron Black, the WRO Secretary, are facilitating this event. So as we move into episode 2 in this series, it's important to recognise the links between the topics that we are exploring. In episode 1, led by Tim Nutbeam, we looked at the details into the likelihood of sustaining spinal injuries during a collision, and then the biomechanical considerations during patient extrication. Now, as we move into episode 2, we are exploring vehicle relocation and can it save lives. The synergy between these two episodes underscores the multifaceted nature of trauma care at road traffic collisions. To tell us more, our guest speaker for this session is Mr. James Kumar. James has a wealth of experience as a first responder at road traffic collisions. So without further ado, let me hand over to James, who will explain further links between trauma care and vehicle relocation.
Perfect. Okay. So like I said, this presentation I'm doing today is probably around about 40 minutes long, and it's on the title of Vehicle Relocation at RTCs, with the question, can it actually save lives? Now, you will see that we have got a bit of a quote up there, which has come from the Exit Project, and also I've used it in a couple of my LinkedIn articles that I've written. You can find me on LinkedIn, you'll see the articles there. That statement that I've got there will become apparent a little bit later on in this presentation. So relocating a vehicle with a patient inside at a road traffic collision is a fairly new concept being taught in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. Despite this being placed on National Operational Guidance in 2021, so a couple of years ago, this rescue solution is considered to be controversial by some within the UK Fire and Rescue Service due to historical training around casualty management. Firefighters have previously been taught to assume that all patients involved in an RTC are likely to have suffered a C-spine injury, specifically a spinal cord injury, and that any movement of the vehicle vertically, laterally, diagonally, could potentially cause paralysis or even worse. It is therefore understandable that concerns about moving a vehicle occupied by an injured patient are being expressed, with lots of people asking questions like, well, surely if we move a vehicle, it would risk further injury and potential litigation claims. Fair questions to ask. However, recent published evidence suggests otherwise. In fact, you could argue that the clinical data actually goes as far to suggest that UK Fire and Rescue Services may be inadvertently reducing patients' chances of survivability by not considering alternative extrication strategies such as vehicle relocation. So with that opening statement, what I'd like to do is just look at the historic approach that we have taken here in the UK around road traffic collisions. So a lot of the training that we've done has come from a manual like this, which is the Fire Service Manual, Incidents Involving Rescues from Road Vehicles. Excuse me a second. And there's statements in here such as, when a vehicle is correctly stabilized, any movement that the casualty will feel is dramatically reduced, and this minimizes the chance of further injury. So with statements like that, you can understand why, for the last 30 years or so, we have taken a very cautious approach at RTCs when it comes to moving the vehicle and moving the patient inside it. We've also used the golden hour, and I really like the golden hour principle because it does give us a bit of a structure of time that we should be working towards, and it also gives us a sense of urgency. So those of you that are familiar with the golden hour term, you'll see that ultimately what it means is you've got 60 minutes from the moment of impact at RTC to 60 minutes later, where we would really like to see that patient receiving definitive care in a hospital. And in that period of time, and I'm talking sort of like effectively from a medical and fire responder perspective, we've got, roughly speaking, 15 minutes to extricate a patient from that vehicle. So this is taking the whole 5 minutes from the time of impact to notification and appliances rolling out the door. Then it can take 10 minutes, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, to get your ambulance crew, fire crew, whoever, at the scene to deal with it. Then we've got that 15-minute window to extricate that patient effectively. Once that patient's then been extricated, we will then want to take them out, do another quick survey on them while they're outside, in the back of an ambulance, taken to hospital. And then by the time they got to hospital, then transported to the bit that they need to be in at that hospital and put onto a bed so that they can start receiving the treatment. We are looking at an hour. So you can see very clearly how 15 minutes is a very, very small window of time. And if we actually look at the average time it takes to extricate a patient from a vehicle, I can guarantee you it's way more than 15 minutes, especially with the way vehicles are being built in this day and age. They're incredibly strong vehicles, and it's taken us longer to get them out. So I like this golden hour concept, and this has been taught, and it's been going around for probably somewhere around 50 years. The other thing that we've historically been teaching in the UK Fire and Rescue Service is our 6-phase team approach. Again, this is a very fire-orientated team approach to dealing with a patient at an RTC, and it is always a patient-centered approach. Now, the first part is scene assessment and scene safety, and this is effectively just doing our 360 when we turn up at a scene, just analysing what we've got in front of us, the type of vehicle we've got, how many patients, all the different types of hazard, whether they're hazards associated with the vehicle or the road that we're on, weather conditions or the ground, the terrain. It's analysing all of that information so that we can start looking at some safe systems that we can put in place to create a safer environment for us all to work in. The next step that we look to after that is about stabilisation. Stabilisation over the years. And I'll give you an example of this type of emphasis. Now, like I said, like Ian said, I've been involved in the fire service for many years, and I've done over 20 years service. When I first joined, and I was at training school, I can recall an instructor presenting us with an RTC, and it was a very simple car on all 4 wheels that had been driven into a barrier with one patient in the driver's seat. And he put a full cup of water on the bonnet of the vehicle. And we were told that we were not allowed that cup. So not a drop of water was allowed to come out of that cup. And if a drop of water was to come out of that cup during the time we extricated that patient from the vehicle, we will have killed them. Now, I don't know if anyone else has experienced training like that, whether it was 20 years ago like me or even more recently, but that's certainly something that we were taught. And this comes from stabilizing the vehicle and this whole emphasis on C-spine management, something that you would have learned about in Tim's talk a couple of weeks ago. So huge emphasis on stabilization, and actually it's got its place. We need to stabilize a vehicle and make sure it's a safe, solid place for us to work on in the very first instance. Second to that is initial access, and this is getting into the vehicle to see the patients that we've got there and start to do some form of a survey to analyze what is wrong with them and what treatment that they will need. We then move on to glass management. And this is, again, if you want to go back 20 years, I was taught smash everything and get it out of your way. I think we have moved on a little bit since then, so we don't turn up and smash everything anymore. But this is about managing the glass at the scene so that we don't get any kind of unforeseen breaks or bits, so glass management was there. Then we started looking at space creation, and this was about doing little things to give us a bit more space. So it might be opening the doors, it might be winding seats backwards and forwards, taking seat belts off so that we've got a little bit more movement there, perhaps moving the steering wheel. This is all the little bits with space creation, which then eases into full access, which is where we start getting all of our big tools out. And again, historically, cutting a roof off a vehicle tended to be the go-to thing when I joined. Again, that's progressed over time as cars have changed and tools have changed. But this is about creating a much greater amount of space so that we can get a patient out of that vehicle, causing the least amount of movement as possible. And then final phase was immobilization and extrication of that patient. So this was our traditional 6-phase team approach. And as you can see, there is no mention whatsoever of vehicle relocation in there. So for many, many years, it hasn't even been a concept that we've even considered because it's not routinely been taught. So what I've got here is an image of a training scenario that we created a couple of years ago here in the UK. And I want to set the scene for you. So the red lorry that you can see in the bottom right-hand side has got a driver that's had a medical event at the steering wheel of that lorry. And we've got a silver Citroen Picasso, I believe it is, that has effectively T-boned and come to rest at an acute angle into the side of this lorry. And the load from the lorry has tipped and fallen onto the vehicle. And what you've got in that vehicle is a driver that has got a lower limb injury and a thoracic injury as well. We ran this scenario several times over with different crews, both different medical crews, different fire crews, just to see how long it would take to extricate. And the average time it took to deal with this type of scenario was somewhere in the region of around 1 hour 15 to 1 hour 30 minutes. And this was using a very traditional approach that we've just explained with our 6-phase team approach. So working our way through that, our officer in charge would have done a 360 of this incident, would have determined there was a couple of patients, would have then sent a couple of firefighters over to assess the patients and find out what's wrong with them. While this is going on, a whole load of stability has been put in place on both the lorry and on the silver vehicle too, to make sure that they don't move or go anywhere. Nothing wrong with this approach whatsoever so far. In fact, it's spot on. It's the right approach that we need. We want to make sure that we've got a safe environment for us to go into. Once we now know that we've got the information with the patients, it was then about determining which patient needed to come out first. So the medical patient in the lorry was deemed the time critical one at that time, so they needed to come out. And the other patient in the silver vehicle was a P2, so a priority 2. And they were second to come out. So focus and effort was put into the lorry, rightly so, to get that patient out. What we tended to see when people were following the traditional team approach to this is that crews were looking at the patient in the silver vehicle and were doing a bit of space creation with opening a door where they could, maybe moving a couple of the pallets, and were ultimately coming up with the same plan over and over again. And it was one of two things. They would either take the patient out of the door, the sort of side door, or even a potential side removal of that car, which was quite a tight space to be working in, or they would come straight out the boot with a load of other work in and around it. And it was quite a sort of a timely process to get that patient in and out of it. Again, no vehicle relocation is considered during this scenario whatsoever. And this is what led to it taking 1 hour and 15 to 1 hour and 30 minutes to get that patient out. Now, again, those that listened to Tim's talk a couple of weeks ago will be aware that, a lot of our trauma patients tend to have thoracic, head, abdominal injuries. And these are the types of injuries they tend to die from. And we need to get them out as quickly as we possibly can, but in a safe way. So using our old approach, it can be quite lengthy to get that patient out, which is exactly what we saw. I'm going to come back and revisit this image, but with a slightly different approach a little bit later on. So bear that in mind. So let's move on a little bit. Now, again, Tim talked about the exit project a couple of weeks ago. So again, if you want to know more information on that, I absolutely recommend you go and see that. It is fascinating. I was fortunate enough to be involved with some of this exit project work, certainly from a fire service perspective of extricating patients out in the traditional format of creating some space, holding onto the patient's head and taking them out on an extrication board or a long board, spine board, whatever you might want to call it, and then putting them onto trolley for them to then go off to hospital. And some of the things that we concluded with this approach, and bear in mind, we tried this with lots of different patients in lots of different vehicles using different approaches, such as a self-extrication, an emergency extrication where they effectively came out of the door, just an open door, a full side removal, and then the traditional roof off removal. And what we concluded with this study was that the safest way for a patient to get out when we're looking at a spinal cord injury was for them to self-extricate, as opposed to any of the other techniques that we used. Now, clearly, if you can ask someone to step out of a vehicle and they step out, that is quite a quick extrication time. This will take a minute, whether they do it themselves or whether we support them to get out. Looking at all of the work that goes into removing a roof from a vehicle with your ripping and stripping, stability, glass management, simultaneous activity with tools, whether we're using cutters, whether we're using a reciprocating saw or other bits and pieces, that all takes a lot of time. And then we introduce the extrication board and go to extricate that patient. And we found that that created more movement on the spinal cord than it did if they were just to get out. So what we concluded from that was that the safe way to get a patient out of a vehicle, if we're worried about spinal cord injury, is for them to self-extricate. So that was fascinating. Like I said, go and look at what Tim has done with this work, because it is really, really good. But we're here to talk about vehicle relocation. And there was one study that took part, one paper in particular, that we really looked at and analysed for vehicle relocation. It was this one here. Comparison of the demographic injury patterns and outcome data for patients injured in motor vehicle collisions who are trapped compared to those patients who are not trapped. So this was one of the papers that Dr. Tim Nutbeam and a few other clinicians produced a couple of years ago. And just to really, really break this down into simplest form, it analysed 63,625 patients that had all been involved in a road traffic collision or a motor vehicle collision. And they were around the UK over a period of around sort of 8 to 10 years. Of those, 6,983 were physically trapped and 56,642 were not physically trapped. And those of you that are good at maths will see that if you added those two numbers together, there is a discrepancy of 1,512 people who, for whatever reason, we didn't have enough data to utilize in this study. So they were excluded from this paper. Now, I want you to ask yourself a question. Of those physically trapped or not physically trapped patients, which ones do you think had the more significant injuries or the more life-threatening injuries? So just give you a moment on that one. Those of you that said the physically trapped patients, you'd be absolutely right. So we found that the physically trapped patients had the worst injuries. And the injuries that they tended to have, which were life-threatening, tended to be head injuries, thoracic and abdominal injuries. Note, it wasn't spinal in there, which again is what we've kind of been led to believe for many, many years. It's all the spinal thing. So what did this study conclude? Well, it concluded this: trapped patients are more likely to die than those who are not trapped. The frequency of spinal cord injuries is low, counting for less than 0.7% of all of the patients extricated. Patients who are trapped are even more likely to have time-critical injuries requiring an intervention. So extrication takes time, and when considering the frequency, type and severity of injuries reported here, the benefit of movement minimization may be outweighed by the additional time taken. The key point here: improved extrication strategies should be developed, which are evidence-based and allow for the expedient management of other life-threatening injuries. Remember what I said at the very beginning? I had that quote put up on the very first slide about, are we doing a disservice to 99.3% of the patients that we attend at a road traffic collision? This is where it comes from. Our whole approach up to this point has been about spinal cord minimization. And even then, the data that we've concluded of holding the head and extricating someone doesn't support the techniques that we've been using up to this stage. And now what we're also seeing is it isn't spinal cord injuries that people are dying from at RTCs. Over 99% of people are dying from these other injuries. So surely it stands to reason that our focus should be concentrating more on the 99.3% of the patients we go to rather than the 0.7%. I'll leave that one with you there. So, improved extrication strategies. This is where vehicle relocation came back into play. Now, I say came back into play because it actually existed before. This isn't a brand new thing that has only just been talked about. This isn't a James Coomber idea. It isn't anyone else's idea. This has happened before. And then we started to see around 30 to 40 years ago, a real shift in movement minimization and this spinal cord, this fear of moving someone with a spinal cord injury. So actually, it's been around for a while and it's already being utilized in some little pockets within the UK Fire and Rescue Service. And it is definitely being utilized and utilized very well in other areas in the world. And I've done some work with the Australian Fire and Rescue Service, certainly around the East Coast, Port Stephens area. And I know there's been some great examples of a relocation of a vehicle with a patient inside it that have been used that have had a positive impact on the patient's outcome. So it's really, really good to see. The other thing I need to emphasize with vehicle relocation here, and we're talking about relocating a vehicle with a patient inside it, sometimes relocating a vehicle without a patient inside it as well. This isn't the go-to tool for every single RTC that we'll ever go to. This is just another tool to add to our already pre-existing large toolbox that we have. Okay. So let's explore this a little bit further. Is it a viable thing to relocate a vehicle? Now, for me, there's a few factors that we need to satisfy before we consider relocating a vehicle. So let's start with the first one. Will the overall incident be safer for rescuers if we relocated? And what I mean by this is, let's use an example. So you've got a car that has left the roadway and it has gone down into a ditch, a couple of meters down into a ditch. So the front end of the vehicle and the side is in maybe sort of half a meter deep of water. You've got a very wet, slippery kind of surface going down to it. You've got rescuers, fire, police, ambulance, who other first responders are working in a wet, damp, slippery, dangerous environment with unknown hazards underneath the water. Is that a safe incident for us to be working on for a prolonged period of time? Or if we relocated that vehicle and brought it back up onto the roadway with complete 360 access, car on all four wheels on nice hard standing, which one of those two is the safer incident for us to go to? And I'd like to think that all of us here would be in agreement that, well, it's the car on all four wheels on tarmac with great 360 access. Absolutely. And we know that we could probably achieve a much quicker rescue from that vehicle on the roadway too. The other thing we want to satisfy ourselves with is, if we relocate this vehicle, can we successfully extricate a patient quicker? So it might take us 5 to 10 minutes to relocate that vehicle, but if we know that by doing that, we can extricate that patient very quickly by opening a door and getting them out, well, there we go. We've hit that 15-minute marker in that golden hour that we spoke about earlier. Or we leave that vehicle in the ditch, and we're probably looking at an hour, hour and a half sometimes to extricate the patient from there in very difficult conditions. Excuse me again. Now, from a fire service perspective, I think it's quite easy for us to analyze these two elements. Now, the final element that we need to analyze is the patient themselves. So will it benefit the patient or the patients that we've got inside that vehicle? Now, this is where we've got to do a complete analysis of what is wrong with the patient to the best of our ability. And that can be done by fire, ambulance, but you've got to work within your own kind of, clinical protocols that you've got with whatever country you're in at the moment. But we need to analyze what is wrong with that patient, full top to toe survey, work out what's wrong, communicate that information back to fire commander, ambulance commander if you've got one there as well, and satisfy that moving the vehicle will benefit that patient. So again, if we take the patient that has got a head injury, thoracic injury, which we know is a larger killer of trauma in road traffic collision patients, maybe by relocating it and creating some amount of movement would be better on the risk versus benefit, because we can achieve a much quicker extrication to definitive care, which is where they need to be, which ultimately will enhance their survivability chances. So we've got to satisfy all of these three things before deciding to relocate the vehicle or not relocate the vehicle. Hoping that makes sense with people. We've asked, is it safe for the patient? So again, I just want to touch very briefly on this bit here. That's Dr. Tim Nutbean that you can see in this image here, along with one of our crash test dummies, if you like, that took part in some trials that we did over in South Wales here in the UK last year. So we ran some trials around vehicle relocation, and we put some patients inside vehicles that were in different positions. And I'll show you some examples on video in a moment. And what you can see on this lady's head here is a biomechanical sensor, which is analyzing the amount of movement that we're getting in her head in comparison to her body, where we've got other sensors, to see what type of spinal cord movement, etc., that we're getting from relocating a vehicle with the patient inside it. And the conclusion that we kind of came to with this is that we're not creating any more in the way of movement than we would do if we were extricating under the traditional routes. Now, this is something that kind of like struck me a couple of years ago when I really started looking into relocation as a concept. For many years, I was of the firm belief that we needed a very still and stable vehicle to work on and to get that patient out. However, let's ask ourselves, what happens to that patient once we've got them out of that vehicle? Let's go on a journey with them. They come out of the vehicle, which we have physically moved them out of. We then put them perhaps on the floor in the first instance, or on whatever board it is that we've taken them out of. We lift them up off of that board and put them onto a trolley, which would then go into the back of an ambulance. So that trolley now travels down the road with the patient on it, sort of like jiggles about a little bit because most of our roads here aren't particularly smooth, gets into the back of an ambulance. Patient's now in the back of an ambulance before they then go on a journey to the hospital. And it might not be the nearest hospital, it might be a trauma specialist hospital that they go to. So that could be a 10-mile journey for them to go on in the back of an ambulance, moving. Once they get to hospital, they then get taken out the back of an ambulance on that same trolley again. They get transported to an area within the A&E department and then taken to another area where they're then taken off of the trolley and put onto another bed. And while they're on that bed, they might then get moved to another part of the hospital where they get put through a scanner, so on and so forth. The point I'm making here is we're all about patient movement minimization in the very first instance, an RTC. However, once we've analysed what is up with that patient and the type of treatment that they need, when we get them out of the vehicle, they are moved a huge amount, albeit in a safe environment with, one on a stretcher. So why have we always been worried and concerned about moving a vehicle with a patient inside it, even just a millimetre? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? But like I said, with the studies that we did here in South Wales, we found and concluded that we didn't see much in the way of any additional movement on a patient after doing a relocation. And it's key to add here as well that we would absolutely advocate that if you're going to relocate a vehicle with a patient inside it, that you have a rescuer or a buddy that sits with them, that explains exactly what's going on and stays with them all the way through. And should anything happen for whatever reason where you think, do you know what, we need to stop this, you can very simply communicate and say, right, let's stop this relocation now. So we conclude it is safe for the patient. Now, we spoke about considering vehicle relocation, but where should we consider it? Now, I think our RTC team approach that's existed for as long as I've been alive is probably due a refresher. And this is one other model that is out there. This is the Dunbar model that has been in his latest Lucas book. We could also adapt it and put it into our traditional model, and you may even have other ideas as to how it goes. But what I like about this is it does already exist in this new concept and this new model here. So starting in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got safety and additional resources. So this is just about doing our scene assessment, scene safety, like we've always done. And also it's got in there the consideration of additional resources. Now, this might already be the point at which you're thinking about relocation of a vehicle. So you might have turned up in your fire appliance or ambulance and gone, do you know what? That car is in a really precarious position. Maybe it's, you know, in amongst some trees and some bushes, difficult access to get to. Wouldn't it be useful if we had a winch here, or, you know, an appliance of some way that could lift this vehicle from there and put it somewhere else? Or it might even be that it's pressed up against a wall and I just need some additional personnel to just roll this vehicle back in its simplest form so that I can get to the door. So great bit to add in there. And we've got the consider vehicle relocation aspect in as the very second thing. So we're at the scene, we're already considering vehicle relocation in the very, very early phases of the RTC. Now, next phase is incident commander formulates initial extrication plans. So for an incident commander to formulate an effective extrication plan, they need to know information about the vehicle, the way it's sitting, the construction of that vehicle, whether it's petrol, diesel. If it's an electric vehicle, it might not be able to roll particularly easily. So there's lots of bits and pieces to consider with that vehicle. You also need to know what is wrong with that patient. We cannot form an effective extrication plan without good knowledge on what is wrong with that patient. We can't default to, let's get that door open, let's take a side out, or let's take the roof off. It's got to be appropriate for that patient. So you need fire and medical to be communicating with each other and coming up with a joint plan. Medical people, you are the experts with the patient and what is wrong with them. Fire, you are the experts with how to extricate people from vehicles and utilize the tools if you need to utilize those tools. Use everyone to their strengths to formulate that plan. Make sure it is patient-centered throughout, and you can always review this at any stage throughout too. So then when we start to see after phase 3, we go through the traditional kind of approach of stability, initial access, glass management, so on and so forth. Okay. And what I really like here, at the very end, we've got performance evaluation or debriefing. Now, it's so important again to debrief an incident and work out what we can learn from. It's all very good and well to high five each other and go, yeah, that went really, really well. But let's actually start to be a little bit more hypercritical of each other and think, do you know what? That did go well. However, what could we do that would make it even better next time round? Or if we have got something wrong, fess up to it. Put your hand up and go, do you know what? I got that wrong. I've done that so many times. And I think it's really, really important to show a little bit of vulnerability and say, yeah, I got this wrong this time. Let's look at what we could do better next time round. You know, so love that. So this is one model that we could utilize moving forward that has vehicle relocation in there. Otherwise, we could always look at vehicle relocation in other models that pre-exist. So what I'm actually going to do here is show you an example of the most simplest form of vehicle relocation that we've got. So we've got a car on all 4 wheels, and we're going to do a controlled maneuver. And again, this is one of the examples that we did over in South Wales. So the reason I like using this as an example is any of us can do this now. As long as we've got a vehicle with 4 wheels that will effectively roll and not cause us any problems. So just show you how we do this. And now take a note that you've got a commander on the left-hand side that is coordinating what is going on. The patient inside has been fully assessed, is aware of what's going to happen, and we'll have someone with them talking them through the process of what is happening. Now, when it comes to relocating a vehicle like this, it's got to be a nice, slow, steady, methodical movement with no sudden start, end, jerks in the middle wherever we possibly can. So nice and steady. Let's just show this one. Okay. What you'll see there at the very first instance is everyone had the vehicle braced and we had a chock behind the wheel. Then the handbrake was released. So now that vehicle's not going to go anywhere. Then it's slowly rolled into a position which gives us greater access. So now what we've got is we've got some great access to the driver of this bronzy coloured Nissan Micra. Equally, if there was a driver in the blue vehicle on the other side, we've got even better access there. Go back to what Tim was saying a couple of weeks ago about extrication planning. We could open the door, potentially ask that patient to step out so that they can get onto the ambulance stretcher, off to hospital for definitive care. The other thing that's happened here as well is you'll note that when the handbrake went on at the very end, the rear chock has gone back in again. And ideally what we'd have is another chock going in from the front, just to stop any potential movement forwards or backwards. So this is vehicle relocation in its absolute simplest form. And I hope you'd agree that this can drastically reduce an extrication time of a patient if done effectively. Now, let's come back to this example that we looked at earlier on. So exactly the same scenario. Lorry drivers had a medical event, and we've now got the silver Citroen Picasso driver in there with the same injury. So I believe they're thoracic and a leg injury there too. Now, like I said earlier too, we ran this scenario several times over and we got an average time of around 1 hour 15 to 1 hour 30 for an extrication on the patient in the silver vehicle. Different fire crews, different ambulance crews that all been briefed to exactly the same level. One crew out of all of the different crews that we utilized incorporated vehicle relocation. And we had the patient of that silver vehicle extricated, as well as the patient in the lorry, in under 30 minutes. So that took 45 minutes to an hour less time to extricate the patient from that vehicle than it did compared to our traditional methods. Now, I appreciate this is just one example, but if we look at what Tim was talking about with we need to get patients to definitive care in a shorter period of time to take care of the injuries that they're more likely to have, then relocation here absolutely supports that concept, doesn't it? Because it has reduced the amount of time to get that patient out of the vehicle. So there we go. It also made it a lot safer for us as rescuers because we were now effectively working on one lorry with full 360 access. We were working on a car with full 360 access, and all of the other bits like the fallen debris that you can see off the back of the lorry, that was all moved out of the way too. So we drastically reduced the risk to us as rescuers. It sped up the extrication time, and it was in the patient's best interest for us to relocate that vehicle. And this was all jointly coordinated between fire and ambulance at that incident too. So there's a great example of where we've done some training and it proved it worked. So here I've got another video just to show you a different style of vehicle relocation. And what we've got here is a car on its side. I'm just going to pause it here. We've got a car on its side with its roof resting up against this sort of like concrete wall, if you like. Now, if we were to approach this in a traditional sense without relocation, we are looking at a very, very difficult extrication, most likely from the rear tailgate of this vehicle. However, if this was a saloon, that wouldn't be an option. And we would probably be looking at coming in from the top and working in very, very tight environment, very difficult to assess the patient that we've got inside there too, a very prolonged extrication time and putting great risk to us as rescuers for doing it as well. So working in tight spaces, you know, the issues that we could have of working in tight spaces with heavy equipment, etc., and moving a patient out, it doesn't lend itself to a particularly nice extrication. And those of you that have dealt with an extrication like this will be able to sympathize with me on that too. So the plan here is to relocate this vehicle away from the wall safely, utilizing a spreader and a ram. And as you can see on the right hand side, just about, we've got a couple of sets of stand fast, and it doesn't need to be stand fast. It can be any kind of like shoring equipment there. And we've also put something that we call teardrops here in the UK, which is basically a thin bit of plastic on the floor, which just reduces the amount of friction. So it helps those struts, which act as a support, to slide gracefully across the floor. It just assists us with our relocation of this vehicle. Now, what you'll also see while this is taking place is as we move that vehicle away from the wall, we don't want it to fall back. So someone is following up with a wedge to stop it falling back. So it remains stable throughout the entire movement, and it's got to be a well-coordinated event. And you see we've got a video on the bottom left, which is an inside view of what it's like for the patient in there. So we're now at the rear of the car. We've got a bit of space there. So we've got a ram in place, and we're ramming off of this concrete wall against a really strong part of the vehicle. So you need to know where the strength is inside that vehicle before you do this. Okay, so we've done a bit of movement, wedges are going in, a little bit of readjustment so that we can progress this even further to create some more space. This person on the right hand side, his job is to look at those two struts, and if they start twisting, buckling, digging in, he needs to stop the movement so that the person on the left hand side, who's in control of what's happening, can stop it from elsewhere. Incident commander positioning on this is key. They need to see what is going on. So there's an example there of 2 vehicle relocations. Now what I've got here is a slide with a QR code. So I've got about 5 or 6 different videos on vehicle relocation that are available on YouTube. So if you scan here, you'll be able to see all the other examples that we've got that came from that training day that we did to give you a better idea. Please feel free to use those videos as you wish. There's no branding or anything like that on there. I would just love people to look at it as good examples and share them with others, and even just promote discussion. Okay, so I'm going to move it on from here. Another thing that I said existed at the very beginning was vehicle relocation has been in National Operational Guidance. Now, National Operational Guidance is the UK's new best standards, if you like, for what we should be doing for fire and rescue services in relation to policy, guidance, etc. So again, there's a scan QR code at the bottom, which will take you straight to where vehicle relocation has been added to our National Operational Guidance. Like I said, it's been in there for 2 years now, and we're starting to see some UK fire and rescue services adopt this and put it into their training with really successful results. When you do go on the link, animation there, I don't know how I got that one in there, but when you do go on the link, you'll see that here it is. That is where it takes you to. So just scroll down a bit and you'll see relocation of a vehicle with some of the benefits to it there. So pretty much ending the presentation now before we go on to Q&A. So what is next? A review of current practices and policies, including your team approach, something that we should consider. Certainly debriefing incidents in your teams. So whether this is training events, actual events, debrief them and talk critically about what you can do. So be really hypercritical so that you can learn from it, and be open to critique as well. Seek further training and understanding. Practice some basic techniques and build from there. So start off simple and build on it. And another thing that I think is really important, we're doing this more so now in the UK than ever before, is seek clinical agreement with partner agencies. And what I mean by this is, in the UK, we've got such a thing as clinical governance, which is where we're using a medical professional body to analyse what we're doing in relation to best practice out there. So ultimately, it would incorporate studies such as these studies that we've used here today or within the Exit project that help create a different approach moving forward that is of benefit to the patient and to us as rescuers. But having that clinical agreement and link with someone is a really useful thing to do as well. So that is it. That is the end of my presentation. And I'm now going to hand back to Ian, I believe.
Hi, James. Thanks very much for your presentation. Very informative. It's nice to see the tie-in between the two presentations, the one you've just given and the one that Tim gave a couple of weeks ago. So we have a couple of questions here. The first one is from Victoria Redhead. Thanks, Victoria, for putting this on. And her question is, have there been any studies with regards to relocation of electric vehicles involved in collisions, considering some of the potential risks associated with this type of vehicle compared to traditional fueled vehicles?
This is a really, really good question. Electric vehicles, I'm going to absolutely steer this question towards a guy called Kurt Volmaker from Belgium. Kurt has done a huge amount of research in electric vehicles, and equally, there's been another couple of people as well. You've got to forgive me. There's a lady in Australia that's done a huge amount of research on this too. I will find her name and forward this back so that you can ask these people this question. But ultimately, I do understand the concern of relocating an electric vehicle, because we are told we should not move an electric vehicle forwards or backwards. There are ways around it. So the ways around it, there's things such as GoJacks that exist, which are, for anyone that's not familiar with GoJacks, they're effectively like little roller skates that you put in wheels. And it's the way people move vehicles around in car showrooms. So they'll put them underneath a wheel, jack it up ever so slightly, and you can relocate a vehicle without worrying about the wheels going round and generating any kind of electricity. It's also one of those things that if you can't relocate it, then we just go back to what we've been doing all along anyway. There's another option, high ab usage. So with a high ab use, you can get sort of like chains or strops around wheels. You can lift it ever so slightly, move it across too. So for a vehicle on all four wheels, there's a couple of alternative approaches to relocating an electric vehicle. But yeah, I totally get it. And I really, really suggest that you hunt out Kurt Volmaker and see the research and work that he's done on this. And this other lady in Australia, I really cannot remember her name. I'm so sorry.
Emma Sutcliffe.
Okay. Say that again, Ian.
Emma Sutcliffe.
Emma Sutcliffe, that's the one. Yeah, she's the one. She's done loads of great work on it.
James, thanks for that. And Victoria, we'll maybe look at getting Kurt on a future webinar. So thanks for your question. So we just flick back. People were mentioning the GoJacks, James, in relation to that earlier question. So there's some information put on the chat bar regarding them. So and there's a question here we have, in your opinion, how might the integration of vehicle relocation strategies and lessons from biomechanical research, as discussed in episode 1, lead to more comprehensive trauma care? How do you see that evolving over the course of time? And if we're looking at, you went back to, look back about 30, 40 years ago, how do you see extrication in the next 10, 15 years?
Great question. I think we've already seen a huge change with vehicle construction over the last 30, 40 years. I look back, I would say I have 20 years experience in the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and the extrications I went to 20 years ago are very different to the ones that I go to now. I used to see a huge amount of physical entrapment many years ago, and statistically we used to go to more females entrapped than males entrapped. And this is just down to things like the way a vehicle has been constructed. Even our crash test organizations that crash our vehicles, they will use male dummies, or have historically used male dummies, to analyze the crash impact on vehicles, whereas we're seeing a huge change in that. So hopefully we're going to see less people physically entrapped in vehicles as time moves on, with the construction of vehicles changing, the testing around crashing those vehicles, and more emphasis looking at male and female differences in the way that we build vehicles too. With extricating patients quicker and less focus on C-spine, but not no focus. It's just less emphasis on C-spine management, but more focus on the other injuries. I believe that we're going to see a reduction in deaths, and that is ultimately what we're hoping to see with extricating people safely but quicker from vehicles, is that we see a reduction in deaths. that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thanks for that, James. That was excellent. That's spot on. So you also gave us an example of the team approach. So what other examples are there out there in relation to that? How you deal with these type of incidents? How we relocate vehicles from around the world? Are there any other things that our colleagues from around the world can look towards?
I mean, there's a lot of chain usage over in Scandinavia, certainly for relocating vehicles and pulling a vehicle apart potentially. So there's some Scandinavian studies to look at around there. As for other approaches other than the 6-phase team approach and the Dunbar model that I've used today, they're probably the most traditional one that I see, and the one that I think that's probably got the most potential moving forward as a model. As for anything that comes close, I'm struggling, to be honest, at the moment for another model. It might be that yourself, Cameron, or even Ian might have seen something else that you would suggest, but for me, I kind of see that I can see an adaptation to what we're doing already with our 6-phase team approach, and just incorporating vehicle relocation into that in the very first instance, and then in the space creation phase, a very simple way of just keeping a method that already pre-exists but just adds in this element. So I could see that being in there.
Okay, James, thanks for that. I have another question here from Andrew Struck. The question is, James, what's your current practice regarding manual C-spine immobilization at RTCs, and is this challenging in all following the exit project research? We currently vary hands-on. But your thoughts on patient C-spine self-immobilization, where appropriate, would be welcome.
Okay, this is a James Coomber opinion, by the way, that I'm going to give here now. But it's an evidence-based James Coomber opinion. I'm going to give you a quick story. A few years ago, so probably more than that, probably about 8 years ago, I remember going to an RTC with a vehicle that had come off of the motorway, so doing a 70 mile an hour. It was traveling at 70 mile an hour, left the motorway, come to an abrupt stop there, just off the motorway in a grass verge. I got into the back of this vehicle, traditionally held C-spine like this, while I was the only patient carer that was there. So ultimately, I'm doing this. My hands are now taken up, and I'm unable to do a full assessment of anything else that's going on with this patient. Very quickly, this patient, who had a hypoglycemic event at the wheel, so basically kind of drifted unconsciousness, came off the road and then came back round, started to get quite aggressive, if you like, inside the vehicle. And I was following them around the vehicle with my hands like this, saying, stop, stop, stop. You know, you're going to do some damage to your head. And it was in that moment that I had the realization that there's probably nothing wrong with this person's C-spine, because if there was, they wouldn't be thrashing around in the front of the vehicle, moving their head like so. And if you take this principle to someone that's got a really bad broken leg or a broken arm, if they've got a broken bone, they're not going to be thrashing it around going, this really hurts. They will be self-splinting. So to answer that question, C-spine, it's important, but it's unlikely to kill patients. The data proves that the thing that's going to kill patients is all of the other injuries. It's the head injury, it's the traumatic thoracic injuries, abdominal injuries, pelvic, internal bleeding. That is where we are concerned about our patients. And if my hands are stuck on someone's head, I can't do much else to monitor what is going on with all of their other vital signs. So as long as that patient is able to maintain their own C-spine, I personally would advocate that they maintain their C-spine themselves, and we do an assessment and monitor all the other injuries. If I've got 2 responders with me, and one of us is able to do everything to do a top-to-toe survey, do that, get your other person to sit in the back and hold the head. But if I'm by myself, C-spine is less of a priority than all of the other things that are going to kill them, such as major bleeding, airway management and breathing.
James, thanks for that. And I think we are now fast running out of time for the questions. There are a couple more, so I would maybe suggest to those who are putting them in to maybe, if you don't mind, contacting you directly or putting it, and we can pass these questions on to you. I'll pass back to Ian now, but thanks, James, for your input.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you, James. Really insightful presentation. So hopefully those who watched the first episode can see why we felt it was so important that we got James to deliver this presentation on vehicle relocation, because the two subjects are so significantly linked. So yeah, as we conclude episode 2, I want to extend the WRO's sincere appreciations to James for sharing his expertise and shedding light on vehicle relocation. So hopefully the insights that everybody's gained today will influence some joint decision making at road traffic collisions moving forward. Thank you all for your participation. Until next time, please stay safe and keep making a positive impact. Thank you, everybody.